Hey, welcome back to my basement. This is Jeremiah Wolf, and I want to talk today about Cisco and the future of Cisco. You may be aware, so today is August 17th, 2020, and you may be aware, but last week Cisco had their fourth quarter earnings call, and there's been some really interesting reactions out in the news because of it. Some very positive, some incredibly negative. But I found an article that while it has a negative tone, it seems pretty realistic to me, and I think it would be beneficial for us as networking professionals, people who are, either have a career in networking or building a career in networking. It's probably good to know, where the big players are going, especially if we're, tying our wagon to or hitching our wagon to their prosperity. So, Cisco has been around for a long time. They have been the biggest name for a long time. But, times change. So let's take a look kind of what's going on. And we will come over here. There we go. So this article from Futurium, I never even heard of it before, but it's a pretty good article. Came up on my news feed. And let's take a look here. So the title of the article, Why Cisco is in Existential Crisis. Of course, I'll have the article linked in the description. Why Cisco is an existential. That's some pretty powerful words, right? Especially if you're out there studying right now. If you're going to spend the next 6 months or a year working on your CCNA, CCNP, whatever it is you're working on, a CCIE, it's a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money potentially. Do you really want to take the chance if Cisco's not going to be around? So let's go through this. Why Cisco is an existential crisis. I'm just going to kind of read the highlights here. So if you're not aware, they had their earnings call again last week. And the long and short of it is company revenue fell 9% to $12.15 billion for the quarter, down just over $1 billion from the year before. Now, what's really fascinating about this is it highlights one of the biggest problems, and it's important. Like, if you're going to be, it is my opinion that if you're going to be out there in the workforce as a professional, especially someone whose career is built around someone else's tools. So if you are a VMware engineer or a Cisco engineer, a Juniper engineer, your future and prosperity is in many ways tied to that company. And while, as things shift, you can retrain and whatever, that's sometimes not always as easy as it sounds. Completely aside, I was reading an article today about why there's this huge, thing about coding. Everyone can code. It's super easy and fun. It's like, no, coding is actually a challenge. It requires creativity, requires technical skill, it requires focus, it requires the ability to constantly be learning. This ludicrous idea that, what's that? You were a coal miner and lost your job? Well, learn coding. It's so fucking ridiculous. It makes me angry that they pander to these people who are in bad, potentially in not the best situation because of job loss or whatever, and make it sound like, oh, you can just learn coding. Like, just go to a boot camp. It's no big deal. Anyway, but we know better. We know that technical skills are difficult. They take effort. So. But anyway, so the company revenue fell 9%. Now, it fell 9% during a global pandemic. Now, it's important to say that even if there hadn't been a pandemic, they almost certainly would have been down for the year. So it's not 100% due to COVID. But come on, people! Like, there's a global pandemic. You think businesses hadn't cut back on purchases? They hadn't cut back on projects? Like, 10%, it's not so bad considering everything that's going on. But this really highlights one of the big problems that we have in our business culture. Now, it's interesting because here in the United States, I'm not an expert. I don't have an MBA or anything like that. But as it has been explained to me, and this could be entirely wrong, but as it has been explained to me, the way that the rules, regulations, the laws around sort of business and finance are written here in the United States we in many cases force businesses to take a short-term view. So, one of the big complaints that anyone with a brain has is, why is business always so focused on this quarter, this quarter, this quarter? What about making sacrifices this quarter to ensure the long-term success of the company? That seems reasonable. It seems logical. But the way that the rules and regulations are written, businesses are discouraged from running their business that way if it is a publicly traded business. And beyond being discouraged, in some instances, it might actually be illegal, which is insane. But it just shows how greed and money has just has taken over every aspect of our society. We're talking about business here, but I feel like the idea that a business should be stable long term and be able to provide for its customers and employees and investors long term seems reasonable, but in today's world, that's not. So in my mind, this isn't so bad, down 9% during a global pandemic, but to investors, this is potentially the death knell of Cisco. Existential crisis looms. Cisco's infrastructure platform group was down 16%, and applications down 9%. Quoting from the article here, this is quoting from the article, the company is now in existential crisis. What kind of company is Cisco? On the marketing side, the company likes to tout its move into software and cloud, but in the numbers, there is little to show for it. The M&A, I believe that's materials and acquisition strategy, has been all over the map, from integrated optics to silicone and business analytics and security software. Meanwhile, the company has been shrinking revenue-wise for years. Now, so that is a little bit more nuanced of a view. They've been shrinking revenue-wise for years. That's a little more concerning, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Cisco is losing to the cloud. Again, quoting from the article, the central problem is that Cisco has sacrificed innovation in recent years for preserving cash and dividends for its conservative investor base. Now, as I was just saying, in some ways this is a choice by management, but in other ways this is indicative of our society, business culture, and our current regulations, rules and regulations around business. So basically what this is saying is that Cisco is focusing more on making their investors happy in the short term than on actually providing for the future of the business. Continuing, the company talks about innovation and bold technical visions, but basically it is run by the sales guys and bean counters. Now, this is a serious problem. Being run by sales guys and bean counters. This is a serious problem. And let me share a couple of examples of this, how I have seen this strategy play out. Now, what we see oftentimes in business, and if you've been an engineer for a while, you've definitely been exposed to this, almost certainly. Sales runs the company. Sales makes more money. Sales is given bigger bonuses. Sales is given all the rewards, all the kudos. When there's a strategy planning trip, I used to work for a company once a quarter, once a half. They would fly all the salespeople off to the Caribbean somewhere for a week-long strategy meeting. When us engineers needed to have a strategy meeting, we would go grab some Taco Bell at the drive-thru and then come back to the office. So, but that's just kind of the way it is. Sales is always going to be seen as more for the company. And a couple of times I've seen this play out in problematic ways. I worked for this one company years ago, back around the turn of the century, and they had been a VAR, right? So they sold stuff. They pushed boxes. That was their business model. They pushed boxes, and they were good at pushing boxes. The problem was pushing boxes was making less and less revenue, less and less margin, and therefore less and less revenue. And so they wanted to move over into becoming a what are they called? Not a service provider. What were we? an integrator, or an integrator. So it was less about selling stuff and more about selling services. And but at the same time, the people who had made their way into management, upper management, were all old ex-salespeople. They had made lots of money for the company in sales by pushing boxes. And so they had become the directors and the vice presidents. And what we saw is, as the company moved into selling services, these people were incapable of understanding the nuance and the effort and the costs behind actually selling services. So the specific example, a couple of specific examples. One, we sold a project. This was like a $20 million project for doing point of sale systems for a major retailer, nationwide retailer. And it was basically this. There would be a server and 3 to 5 workstations per store. And these were like, 2,000 stores or something. A server and 3 to 5 workstations per store. These are the cash registers, but they were just Windows machines. And so it included us staging the server, staging the workstations, testing all the equipment, so testing the cash drawers, testing the receipt printers, testing the scan guns, making it all work together, running test transactions, putting the parts database, which was massive at the time. It was like 13 gig or something, and while that doesn't sound like anything nowadays, I download that in an hour, it's no big deal. Back then, that was an obscene amount of data, just obscene. So it was this massive database, and we had to update it, do all this stuff. So there's all these tasks we had to do, and the salesperson who had become the director and who had basically wrote the proposal and signed off on everything and made the deal, she lived in this huge house. She drove a land yacht of an SUV. She went on fancy vacations. She wore all the designer clothes. But she had no idea how services worked. So we sit down. This is, oh my God. We sit down. Okay, she's in her like 30s or 40s, right? She's the boss. And I'm like 22 years old or 24 years old. And we sit down in a meeting. And I say, okay, well, I've gone over all the stuff you've given me. We've run a few tests of the processes that are required, and I need 20 guys to do this work. Just the staging part of it, not even the installation, because we would also then fly out and do the installs at all the stores. And she's like, well, I budgeted for 5. And I said, well, it's going to take 20. Like this isn't, like we can either have 5 guys, 5 guys. I would like some 5 guys. The food. Calm down, you pervert. We'd either have 5 guys, and this will take, 4 times as long, or we can actually hit the timeline that you specified and have with 20 guys. And like she was just like, no, figure it out. And that was her mindset. Like she had no idea. So this company, because of that project, ultimately went bankrupt. Crazy. It was a whole crazy situation. So, when we look at the company talks about innovation and bold technical visions, but basically is run by sales guys and bean counters, that's where you start running into problems, because sales guys, they don't live in reality. They're like politicians, right? Politicians, we all know this. We're all tricked by it every political cycle. We still vote for the person who tells us what we want to hear, even though we know they can't deliver. Or if, here in the United States, you hear a presidential candidate talking and you're like, I've actually read the Constitution and you don't have that power. So how are you promising this? But for some reason, we all fall for it. And it's the same thing. These sales guys, they promise the world. They don't understand how the real world works. They don't understand what's involved in actually making things work. So they use buzzwords and spin, and they think that somehow they're going to build a business. And, you can trick a few people into buying stuff based on buzzwords and spin, but that's not going to last forever. So this is a genuinely concerning issue. The company talks about innovation and bold technical visions, but basically is run by sales guys and bean counters. Materials and acquisition, I think that's what M&A stands for. Materials and acquisition record, where's the growth? Again, quoting from the article. Cisco has tried to grow with acquisition, but its track record is mixed. A couple of its older acquisitions, $7 billion for Scientific Atlanta in 2006 and $600 million for Flip Video in 2009, now seems kind of bizarre. I remember when they bought Flip Video, and I was like, what? You're buying handheld video cameras? What does that have to do with? So weird. It was so weird. They were chasing a trend. Somebody spent $600 million to chase a trend that promptly died out a couple years later. Now seems kind of bizarre. A cable box company in a consumer video camera business, they turned into distant memories. Cisco bought WebEx in 2007 for a couple billion, and that's still around, but it's no Zoom. Cisco doesn't seem to have put much investment or improvement into WebEx. Next to Zoom or even Microsoft's Teams, WebEx is painful to use and feels dated and overly corporate. Now, I would tell you, when it comes to WebEx, I've heard lots of people are using WebEx, but I've also, for my own business, I started doing webinars last year, about a year ago. I started doing webinars for my business. And so I spent a couple of, 3 or 4 months researching, testing, pricing all the different platforms to find something that worked for me. And I've also have done for several years now, I've done video conferences with my clients. So like 3 years ago-ish, I moved my business 100% online. I stopped seeing clients locally. I would only do my coaching sessions online. And so it was all, and for me, Zoom was by far the best solution, price-wise, feature-wise, convenience for my clients. WebEx was just always confusing. It was expensive. It was hard for my clients to set up. Whereas, if I'm working with an elderly person who's just not real comfortable with technology, Zoom, we can get them going, and either they could almost always do it on their own, or I could get on the telephone with them and have them up and running, usually 3 to 5 minutes. So that's interesting, because I've heard some people say, "Oh, Cisco must be making tons of money because of WebEx right now." And I actually saw an interview with what's the guy's name? I always want to say Chambers, because he was the guy when I was when my career was in full swing. What is his name? Chuck Robbins. So, I heard an interview with Chuck Robbins the other day, and he was specifically asked, like, wasn't WebEx making tons of money? And he was like, well, WebEx is definitely up, but it was only up like 10%, which you would think with everything going on, it should be up much higher. And he was saying it's such a small piece of our business that it actually has almost no impact on the bottom line. So continuing with the article, just recently Cisco bought Thousand Eyes, a networking analytics company, for about $1 billion. That could still play out. Last year, it made one of the biggest deals with the acquisition of Acacia Communications for $2.6 billion. Acacia is an optics company. 2017 was a big year with the acquisition of applications performance firm AppDynamics for $3.7 billion, and SD-WAN company Viptela for $600 million. Cisco has fierce competitors in the SD-WAN area, including VMware, Silver Peak, which is being acquired by HPE, and Versa Networks. Continuing, some questions for Cisco to answer. What is the core company strategy in Envision? Cisco claims that it is becoming a software company, but its largest recent strategic moves, buying an optics company Acacia and announcing it will disaggregate its own chips and sell them as a product known as Silicon One, look like they are designed to shore up its hardware business. Which is it? That's a good question. How does it get cloudier? All of the best tech companies right now have been executing well in cloud software. Cisco has missed enormous moves in the cloud infrastructure software, whether it's Kubernetes management and applications, containerization, or cloud security. Cisco is not seen as a leader. It has a big war chest to make bets. Will it make the right ones? So far, it's missed some big ones. It's also a very valid critique. Is it time to put more engineers in charge? Cisco's top managers tend to be marketing and sales people. When you have a conversation with the Cisco person, it usually sounds like an advertisement rather than an intellectual technical discussion. If Cisco is serious about being a big R&D, it needs to roll out some more big-brained technical visionaries and fewer vaporware presentations. Now, this is super critical, and this builds on what we were just talking about a few minutes ago. So in my career, I've worked for two companies. The one I was there for about 3 years before they went bankrupt. The other one I was there for 6 years before I just couldn't take it anymore and left. In both of those companies, same situation. They were run by salespeople. And in both situations, they struggled and struggled and struggled. In fact, the second company, the company for whom I worked for about 6 years, at one point, the owner of the company was so frustrated that that the business was struggling that he hired an outside firm. We spent about $1 million. They came in, they interviewed everyone in the business. They took notes on all of our processes, and they spent like 3 to 6 months just learning our business before compiling this major report. And then I was in management, so I sat down to hear this report. And while they had some interesting input, the big takeaway that they had for our business was, you need to figure out what you're selling, because right now you just sell whatever anybody wants and you can't make money doing that. You need to figure out who you are as a business and sell that. And it was fascinating because after spending $1 million to hear the exact same thing that all of his managers had been telling him, well, all of the lower level managers, he had surrounded himself, the owner of the company, with friends from high school who were now vice presidents and directors. It was kind of absurd, but it was still a $250 million business. But what us lower level managers had been telling him is like, dude, you need to figure out what we're selling. We can't do everything for everybody. Well, that's what this company said, and he just ignored everything they had to say. Eventually, I left the company, and about a year after I left the company, one of my friends who had kind of risen up to fill the vacuum that I had left, and a couple other people, so he was now in a position of authority and a position to know what's going on in the company. He called me up and he was like, dude, he's like, they're basically implementing everything you have been advocating for the past several years. Like, they just threw up their hands and said, okay, we just need to do the stuff that our engineers have been telling us to do. So, and a big part of that was figuring out who they were as a company, what they sold, and selling that instead of just trying to say, oh, what's that? You need this? Yeah, we can do that. What's that? You need this? Oh, okay, we could do that. Now, conversely, I worked for another company who was by far the most successful company I'd ever worked for. They made money like it was going out of style. Money just poured in through the door. And you know how it worked? They had engineers in charge. And these engineers would put together a menu, a playbook of what we sold and how much it cost. This is all we do. We do these things, nothing else. Here's what it costs us to implement. Then they would hand that to sales, and sales would then mark it up appropriately and sell it. And because we were really good at doing a few things, we made shit tons of money. So it sounds like that's where Cisco has kind of gotten away. They've sort of gone astray, and they need to get back to figuring out who they are as a company. And we'll talk about, what happened and why in a few minutes here. It's looking like this is going to be another one of my classically ungodly long videos. Continue with the article. So this is a quote from Robbins from the investor call. So this is quoting Robbins from the investor call. At the same time, we're going to rebalance our R&D investments to focus on key areas that will position us well for the future. More specifically, we will accelerate the transition of the majority of our portfolio to be delivered as a service. just rolls off the tongue, right? We will also accelerate our investment in the following areas: cloud security, cloud collaboration, key enhancements for education, healthcare, and other industries, increased automation in the enterprise, the future of work, and application insights and analytics. Now, you cannot read that without being like, what the fuck does any of that mean? It's all keywords. It's all buzzwords. It doesn't tell me anything. But he is saying software. He's basically saying software. And then he goes on to say, continuing quoting Robbins here from the investor call, At the same time, we will continue our focus on the following areas, many of which have been accelerated by the pandemic: multi-cloud investment, 5G and Wi-Fi 6, 400 gig optical networking, next generation silicon, AI, and more. These investments will help define the next phase of our transformation and allow us to bring the best, most relevant innovation to our customers in simpler, more easily consumable ways. So he's saying we are a software company and a hardware company. Oh, and we do AI. What? What is going on here? So it's clear from this call why this writer is saying that he feels, is it a he? I don't know, R. Scott, it was probably, why he feels that Cisco is in existential crisis. So let's, I want to talk about, what's going on and what we're likely to see. So let me bring up this here. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is why all this talk about software. Software. Well, there's been this, let's see if I can draw this. So there's been this wave. It started probably 2000, I'm going to say 2008-ish, and going all the way through, of the software wave. And in my mind, this started really back with the advent of the smartphone. And we start to hear, you remember the old, there's an app for that, there's an app for that, there's an app for that. And it created this sort of mentality that the future was apps, and that you could have an app that could do anything. I mean, if you are familiar with Theranos, what's her name? I can't remember her name, but Theranos, they had an app. It was based on hardware, but they pushed it like it was an app that could diagnose just about every disease from a single drop of blood. It was going to transform the medical industry, just transform everything. Turns out it was a giant scam. But setting that aside, there's an app for that, and we just saw this massive wave. If you said I'm an app developer, people were just throwing money at you. What's that? You know how to write Java? Here's $25 million to make your app. And we saw all these companies pop up and all these apps come up. Well, what's happened since then? So here we are in 2020, and now we all have smartphones, but we don't really use them like we thought we were going to back in 2008, 2010. Back then people thought and it has changed the world. I mean, it has. But what do you use your smartphone for? What do you truly, honestly use your smartphone for? I would argue that most people have 5 or 6 apps that they use every day, and then they have 5 or 6 more that they use on a somewhat regular basis, and that's about it. This idea that you're going to have dozens and dozens of apps, and we're all spending hundreds and thousands of dollars a year on apps, it just never happened, because there's just no need. Like, I have, what do I use? I use Audible. That's probably the most used app on my phone. Audible. I listen to audiobooks. Email, web, browsing a little bit on my phone. What else? Maps, occasionally. Of course, texting, occasionally. Although I honestly do most texting from my computer. I work from home, so, I just pull up the texting app on my computer. I prefer to type rather than, tick, 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 tick. So that's just me. But, so we're the apps thing didn't really happen. But people had put so much effort and energy into this whole concept of software and apps that we had to keep it going. So then we saw this kind of second wave of software that Cisco is also buying into, and this is the software as a service wave. Now, this affects consumers much less, but for my business, I spend I'd have to pull up my financials, but around $2,000 a year, maybe $1,600 a year on software as a service for my business. So that's Microsoft Office, Adobe Creative Cloud, which I actually turned off recently. But I have, billing platform. I have all these different services and platforms that I use. A lot of it is integrated into my website to create a good customer experience, and I sort of built like a whole scheduling and tracking platform for my customers, all on my website. So, so software as a service. And it's the same thing with businesses. We see more and more software as a service. But here's my prediction with software as a service. I don't think it's going anywhere, but it's also kind of like you can't keep adding more services. There's either a need in the market or there's not. Like Microsoft Office, that makes sense. Office 365, that makes sense. It's $10 a month. And if I were to buy Office every few years for like $400, so it's right at the point where they're almost certainly making more money, like guaranteed. It's the only reason they do it. They're making more money, but it's not so much more that people are going to get pissed off about it. At the same time, we're already starting to see, because here's the thing, what you need to understand is that all trends are on a pendulum. So let's come down here. All trends are on a pendulum. These are social trends. These are technological trends. So if it swings this way, it's eventually going to swing back the other way. And for most things, they tend to find a balance until there's some disruptive force, and then the pendulum gets swinging again. So right now we are all in on, software as a service. But I can guarantee you that's going to open up a place in the market for a new competitor who says, hey, I don't charge you a monthly fee. You pay me. In fact, we've already been seeing this. None of the really big things that I'm aware of, but I've definitely been seeing more apps, more, specifically targeted small businesses who are saying, hey, we don't, it's a one-time fee or, a yearly fee for a license, just like it used to be back in the day. Or you buy this version and that's it until there's a new version, and the old version will work until you choose, till it doesn't anymore. So we're already starting to see where there's because everything shifted to software as a service, it created a vacuum in the marketplace where now fixed priced software can come back. And so we're starting to see that already. So I suspect we're going to start seeing more because it's a way for certain things to distinguish themselves, saying, oh, we offer a different plan. Now, it's interesting because Cisco has said they're going to start chasing hardware as a service, where I assume that means that rather than buying routers and switches, you or renting them or leasing them, which is still a thing, you just sign up for a monthly plan, and for $2,000 a month, or I don't whatever it is, they work with you and they build a solution, they install it. Now that actually has me really excited as an engineer, because if that is something that businesses adopt, that means there's going to be a need for a lot of engineers who are going to have to meet with these businesses, size their networks, design their networks, configure their networks, implement their networks, maintain their networks. So it has the potential, if it works, to be a boon for us. So I think it's a dumb idea, to be honest. Hardware as a service. I don't know. Maybe hopefully they're smarter than I am. But if it works, it can be really exciting. So, we saw this. There's this huge push because, what we see here is high margins. And same thing with software as a service. We see really high margins. And investors start to get addicted to those high margins. That's profit, baby. We want money. This is all about money. Don't ever be confused. Any business serves one purpose. That is to make money for its owners or investors. That is the only purpose of any business, is to make money. Never be confused. They're not there to be your friend. They're not there to create jobs. They're not there to help society. They are there to make money. And if in that process they can do some of those other things, fantastic. But usually they do those other things create jobs, help society, because it helps them to make money. Don't be confused. It's a cynical view, but it's the reality. So we've seen these really high margins, and so that's where there's this push for Cisco to move into software. But why is there that push? Well, it's real simple, and this isn't some big secret to any of us. Networking hardware is just fully commoditized at this point. Why do I need a Cisco switch versus an HP switch versus a fucking Netgear switch, for that matter? For so many businesses, that's good enough, you know? And even when it comes to routers, you know, maybe back in the day when we had these really complex WANs and all these different protocols and all these different types of, layer 1 and layer 2 technologies, we needed high-end routers that could do all this stuff. But now everything's Ethernet. Everything's Ethernet. And it's really hard to convince someone to spend $5,000 on a device when a $1,500 device or a $500 device is going to do pretty much the same thing. And that's where Cisco, in my opinion, is almost certainly struggling. There just hasn't been a big push. If we look at hardware, if you look at the average office, maybe you could justify a gig to everyone's desk. But, I suspect in the vast majority of offices, 100 meg to the desktop is probably fine. And, even wireless, okay, so you build out your wireless. But again, you're surfing the web, you're filling out spreadsheets, you're making phone calls. The average office worker doesn't need incredible technologies. There's just a handful of things that every office worker does. They work in a couple of applications, usually some in-house application or spreadsheets or, office documents. There's just no need for all this complex stuff. So, maybe a gig, but then you don't need 10 gigs to the desktop, there's always exceptions. Certainly, video editors or maybe, imaging in a hospital or something. But come on, the vast majority of people, 100 meg, maybe a gig, tops. So there's no push to constantly be buying new hardware. 10 years ago, as networks were, 20 years ago especially, as networks were evolving and becoming new in the office, and then 10 years ago, networks were evolving. There was, we're constantly seeing offices upgrading their equipment. We need more bandwidth. We need more switch ports. But nowadays, it's just not that much of a thing anymore. The WAN is pretty stable. Now, there is some exciting stuff with SD-WAN, creating this sort of overlay network. And I definitely see how, from a management point of view, there's some good stuff that can happen there. But even that, when you look at it, when you start to understand it, you're like, okay, that's cool. And I see how that's good. But there's definitely a cutoff of where the cost benefit really is. And that's going to be for, larger, the higher end of mid-sized businesses. Small businesses, mid-sized business probably really don't need SD-WAN. There's just not that much of a benefit. And then you look at what Cisco's pushing now, SD access, and I look at that and I'm like, what world are you living in? That is the world of salespeople. It's really cool that I can take my computer in building A and I can go to another city and plug in an Office F, and it acts as if I'm still back in building A, and that just doesn't happen. There is a small, tiny percentage of people who need that sort of mobile network connection. 99% of people go into the office, they sit in their cube. There's plenty of people who pick up their laptop and go into a conference room, but they're on the wireless. And they're in the same network as they were on the wired, so it really doesn't matter. Yes, you have some doctors who might go between buildings. You have salespeople or managers who might go between buildings. But this idea that we need to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to build out an SD access network, I just don't. I don't know. Maybe I'm ignorant. Maybe I just don't get it. It's all of it sounds really cool, but sounding cool. One of the things you got to learn as an engineer that is, can be a heartbreaking lesson early in your career, is that just because technology is really awesome doesn't mean anybody wants to fucking pay for it. So I don't know where SDA is going to go. It's one day I think it'll be the norm, but it's a lot of money and really complicated right now for something that pretty low in the, do people really need it? So, all this goes back to, that's why Cisco is losing money, because everything has become commoditized. There's no need for a lot of these new technologies. And even though they keep trying to create new technologies, people aren't buying it. There's just not a need for it. Now, why do I still have hope for Cisco? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that any market can only sustain not any market, but when we're talking about network devices, specifically higher end network devices, you need to spend money on R&D. You need to spend money on manufacturing. Security is always going to be a thing. Like, it's going to be really hard to completely commoditize networking. We're in this space where we can maybe support, 6, 8 different vendors, but it's not going to really grow. We can't support too many more. And what we see historically is that will almost certainly consolidate back into usually around 3. 3 seems to be the magic number, between 3 and 5 vendors. So almost certainly we're in this kind of, cloud computing, and everything is really shaking things up. And there's a lot of figuring stuff out right now. But I guarantee you that within the next 5 years, we're going to start to see all these technologies kind of solidify, containers, Kubernetes, however you pronounce it, VMs, the cloud, SD-WAN, what's it called? Network as software, I forget what it's called, but when you're running your routers and switches on a server, all that stuff it's figuring itself out. 5 years, maybe 7 years, over these next few years, we're going to get this stuff figured out, and we're going to see the market kind of collapse. Some people are going to go out of business. Some companies are going to merge or be bought out, and we'll probably end up with Juniper, HP, and Cisco, and then 2 or 3 other kind of ancillary specialized companies. Probably. But anything can happen. But so Cisco has that tend toward consolidation of the market in their favor. If for no other reason, they're a known quantity. They have a lot of people like us in the marketplace who are certified and experienced in their products. When you have something very technical, one of the biggest barriers to getting your business to take off can be finding people to support and install it. Over the years, I've sat in on many really interesting technical demos of new companies, startup companies that had seemingly amazing technologies, super cool, but it's like, okay, well, who's going to install it? Who's going to support it? And they kind of stumble at that phase of it, and either they have enough money to limp along until they can kind of build up, or they just get bought out or disappear. So, but Cisco's been around. We have lots of skilled, experienced engineers, and they have a shit ton of money. They just got tons of money. So they're going to be around. They're going to be okay. I wouldn't worry if you're studying for Cisco. They're not going anywhere in the near future. Anything can happen. There are plenty of big companies that people thought would be around forever and then eventually disappeared. And then you have companies like IBM who've been around for, over 100 years, and they're just always there. And every time you think, IBM's still in business, and, turns out, yes, and they're still innovating, and they're still making money, and they're doing cool things. So I don't think Cisco's going anywhere soon. I think we're going to be okay. I think Cisco's going to be okay. It's just right now, the investors are investors who are used to quick returns, and they've gotten spoiled over the past decade or so because of these waves of software that have created high margin, low cost products that bring in a lot of money. They're kind of chasing that. And if Cisco can get their shit together and figure out how to focus on what they need to be as a company and not just focus on jerking off their investors, I think we'll be in good shape. So that's my opinion. I hope you found this informative, and thank you for watching.